we're now going to turn our attention to focus on the impact on the nations. And I'm joined by George, Janice and Richard. Thank you for coming along today. Now, we have an interesting panel because George is from the Economics Department and Janice and Richard are both historians. And we're going to be taking a look at the nations of the UK and sort of turning now to focus on what this means for us, which by the sounds of things from the chat was very much where people were at right now in terms of making sense of this and thinking about the impact and thinking about things that maybe they hadn't really considered, like how this might affect trade, how this might affect our travel and things that maybe weren't so explicit in the campaign period. So we've got some widgets coming up on our screen as well, and I'd like you to vote on these. These are scale widgets, so if you could just select the extent to which you agree or disagree. They're all marked quite clearly. So, for example, how important was the national identity in influencing the Leave vote in England and Wales in the referendum, from not very important to very important. So just pick somewhere on those continuums that you think you're at right now, and we'll feed those into this discussion as we go through. So, Janice, let's start taking a look at the historical perspective on Ireland's relationship with the UK. Now, what's interesting here is that we're talking about the way that things are contextualised and the way that people perceive them, as well as what's actually happening.
Yes, I suppose that, what's interesting about Ireland in the whole Brexit campaign is, as you say, it's complicated historical relationship with the United Kingdom in that it was originally an independent country, and this is back long before medieval times, but that over time it has come under British rule, and for a time it was in its entirety ruled by Britain, and that, but then in the 1920s, in 1922, for a whole variety of complicated political reasons, the island was partitioned. So you had 6 counties that formed this new state of Northern Ireland, which remained within Great Britain. And then you had 26 counties then forming the Republic of Ireland, an entirely separate and independent state. And both of those states then have progressed in very different ways. So the Republic of Ireland has now its own government. It has pursued an openly EU affiliation policy. It sought membership of the United Nations and has pursued, in many respects, a very independent line. And then you've had Northern Ireland with its own sort of complications, and particularly the Troubles, a period of sectarian conflict which lasted from the 1970s until 1998, which then brought in the British government and the Irish government as well. So that's all kind of made Ireland's relationship within the United Kingdom, within the British Isles, quite a complicated one.
I mean, national identity has been one of the key things that's come through so many of these conversations. I'd like to ask you first, but also I'd like to ask you both as well. What sort of impact has this had in terms of national identity?
Well, I think the issue really is that within Ireland you've had sort of 2 rival identities, one of which is a unionist identity and one of which is a nationalist identity. So nationalist identities then are adopted largely by Irish Catholics who form a majority in the Republic of Ireland, and but who also comprise a significant minority in Northern Ireland, and which have similarities across that border, right? And then you have a small majority of a Protestant unionist identity, which has effectively controlled the government in Northern Ireland since the foundation of the Northern Ireland state in the 1920s. And those identities, particularly in Northern Ireland, have been at loggerheads. And that was really the source of the violent conflict in Ireland starting in the 1970s. So national identity and what party you were or what group you were, and who you hung out with, who you went to school with, were fundamental in determining and shaping your culture and your worldview, ultimately your politics, and who your friend or foe would be.
George, how's it impacted?
In terms of Scotland, I think it's worth starting with setting the historical context. And Scotland as a nation, prior to the Act of Union in 1707, had long relations with Europe. So Scotland's relationship with Europe, in a sense, goes back further than its relationship with the constituent parts of the United Kingdom. And indeed, even talking about the United Kingdom as if it's not a problematic concept is quite interesting. It is actually a deeply, in some senses, disunited kingdom. And in terms of the political journey Scotland's been on since say, 1979, it has been on a journey that has taken it further and further away, in a sense, from Westminster politics. Since the Scottish government came into play, the divergence between Scottish politics and Westminster stroke English politics had become more and more marked. And the result of the Brexit vote demonstrates that even more clearly. 62% of people in Scotland voted to remain as part of the European Union. Now, a lot of what we're talking about is relatively complex because you're dealing with all these different elections. But if we take ourselves back to the Scottish referendum, that's a Scottish referendum, not the European referendum, one of the main arguments that was put forward by the Better Together, and one of the ironic descriptions of that was actually bitter together. One of the main arguments that was put by the Better Together campaign was that if you, the people of Scotland, wanted to remain as part of the European Union, well, you had to remain as part of the United Kingdom. Now, this was very strongly played out by the Better Together people. Whether that was decisive in persuading a narrow majority of the people of Scotland to vote to remain within the United Kingdom is not clear, but it almost certainly played a part. And ironically enough, what has happened is that by Scotland remaining part of the United Kingdom, we may in fact end up, we being the people of Scotland, outside the European Union. So politics is indeed a kind of complex and contested area.
We've asked you at home how important the national identity was, and we've got two here. So we'd like to first look at the vote in Scotland and Northern Ireland. So how important did you think national identity was in influencing this vote? Let's see what you said at home. OK, so we're going towards the very important. So if we take a quick look at that and then have a look at how important that was for England and Wales, which is going to be the next topic that we're going to discuss. So for the England and Wales one, let's see what you said at home. Oh, sorry. We'll get that up in 1 second. So let's see. There it is. Right. How important was it? Again, reasonably similar. Yeah, again, veering towards the very important side of things. Before we start talking about Wales and England, what are your feelings on that in terms of importance? Do you think it was a very important contributing factor in the decision to leave?
Well, I guess what I think is interesting, and in terms of what I would say is the similarities between Ireland and Scotland, is that both of them were historically countries that were conquered by England, by English monarchs, and have effectively, for a variety of different reasons, and sometimes willingly, allowed themselves to come under the authority of the English. But I think that issue has obviously morphed. And so you have this notion of a separate identity, right? That you're Irish or you're Scottish. And I do think that has allowed for other identities to then come into play, in particular, the one that we're talking about today, this notion of the European identity. The problem for Ireland is that European identity has been embraced by the nationalist community in Ireland, North and South, much more than it has been embraced by the Unionist. So for Unionists now see anti-Europe as part and parcel of their identity, as they affiliate much more strongly with a sense of British sovereignty, with a sense of Britishness, and a protection of the Union, because they see that as protecting their rights. Whereas Irish nationalists feel that for them, the achievement of their rights and their goals are going to be only secured and protected by a continuing relationship with Europe. That's problematic.
George, can I just quickly, because poor Richard is sitting on the other end, and I really want to bring this in because...
I'm very patient.
Pardon?
I'm very patient.
You are very patient. But it just relates to this point about thinking about national identity. You know, we can think about all of these aspects, but language and culture are clearly one, and that's what differentiates Wales, in one sense, in terms of the national language, which, you know, depending on where you are regionally, can be of more importance.
Yeah, I think you could argue, this might be one of the polls, actually, the widgets. I think you could argue that for Leave campaigners, the Brexit referendum was couched as a choice between two unions, between the United Kingdom, between the British Union and the European Union. Now, the British Union, the United Kingdom, I think, you know, rightly or wrongly, is seen by many in Wales, Scotland and Ireland as an Anglo-centric union. So that then necessarily or inevitably has an impact on how people in those areas vote and how it interplays with their sense of national identity. So coming back to your language point, Karen, the interesting thing about the vote in Wales voted to leave by a relatively small margin. But if you look at the breakdown of that vote, those in the areas where the Welsh language is stronger, those areas voted to remain. Areas where Welsh language is weaker, those areas voted to stay. So I think that tells us something quite interesting about the interplay between language as one kind of way of defining identity in Wales, as opposed to kind of the British identity. So I suppose what I'm saying is that the Welsh language, those who speak Welsh, what this kind of correlation implies, feel less affiliated to, the United Kingdom than those who don't speak Welsh in Wales. And, there's a nice comparison to be made in Scotland there, where the whole country, not the whole population, but, there's an even spread of Remain voters across the country, and it was something like 62%. But that means that in Scotland, identity is kind of constituted something different, in a different way. It doesn't rely on language, because Gaelic in Scotland is not the force that Welsh is in Wales. So there's this really fascinating interplay between, language and identity politics, which I think the Brexit referendum was influenced by, but, more intriguingly in a way, has kind of brought out, it's made more visible.
George.
Sticking with the idea of national identity, and also with the 62% of people in Scotland who voted to remain, I mean, you can actually unpack that a little. All 32 of Scotland's local authority areas voted to remain. So it wasn't just certain geographical areas, it was actually broadly across the country. And I think national identity is one of those kind of odd concepts. It means different things to different people. The Remain voters in Scotland did it because of their national identity. The Leave voters in England did it for their national identity. So what might that actually mean? One hypothesis could be that the people of Scotland see themselves, and indeed historically, as I mentioned in my first comment, Scotland for hundreds of years has had a relationship with Europe. It sees itself as a European country. And therefore it is perhaps not that surprising that a kind of internationalist outlook in Scotland and Scottish people, yeah, they want to be part of Europe. They already are part of Europe. If you then glance at England, then their sense of national identity, I think, is much more tightly woven up with the English Empire, which went on to become the British Empire. And therefore they see themselves as being a much more separate country, not part of Europe. And indeed for many hundreds of years spent actually fighting other European countries.
And I was just going to say that in Ireland, what's been so interesting is watching the evolution of a growing European identity within the Republic of Ireland, as they have kind of emerged from quite an inward-looking, isolationist, self-sufficiency sort of policy in the years after the foundation of the Irish state, to one that has embraced European, for not just for idealistic reasons or for identity reasons, but for sheer strategic and economic and financial reasons, right? Strategic European funding has been fundamental in securing the affluence of the new Republic of Ireland. So there's, clear, factual, pragmatic reasons why the Republic of Ireland sees itself as wanting to remain close to Europe and sees its identity now as fundamentally wrapped up in the concept of Europe.
I think that, because that's the kind of an approach that looks at the current situation. I think we also need to remember that history, or the way that history is imagined, is incredibly important to the formulation of these kind of national identities. So, as George was saying, Scotland has a long history of links with Europe. Or you could put it another way, and you could say that Scotland, the popular imagining of the popular idea of Scottish history now, is that it has a long history of links with Europe, and indeed it does. But I suppose what I'm saying is that the extent of those links 500, 600, 700 years ago are irrelevant. What matters is how people think about them. So, Ireland's a good example. There's a lot of there's a kind of idea of Ireland during the Dark Ages, the early medieval period, as the kind of lantern carrier for European civilization. When marauding Saxons and whatnot were kind of breaking down the Roman Empire and plunging civilization into barbarity, Ireland, Christian Ireland, monastic Ireland was seen as a place where learning was preserved. And then from there, Christianity spread back into Europe, which had been overrun by pagans. Now, the accuracy of that depiction is irrelevant. What matters is the traction it has, the grip it has on the collective the collective imagining of the past. And if you contrast those two kind of notions of Ireland and Scotland as European nations, you contrast that with Wales. In Wales, there's not really any comparable narrative of kind of the Wales as a European nation. Welsh historical national identity is defined much more narrowly, I would say, in terms of the relationship with England. You know, England, Edward I conquering Wales in 1282, and centuries of kind of domination, all this kind of thing. So that's obviously a big part of historical identity, or the way history feeds into identity in Ireland and Scotland. But in Ireland and Scotland, there's that European element as well, which is lacking in Wales. And I wonder if, you know, that kind of thing is one factor in the way the Brexit vote played out. It's important to say, though, you know, it would be only one factor, maybe not even an overriding factor, because, you know, there's lots of other things that that have been kind of mooted as an explanation for the Brexit vote, whether, you know, rich versus poor or educational divide, young versus old. But we can throw different versions of national identity and different imaginings of national history into that mix, I think.
I think that, I mean, I just want to sort of, yeah, absolutely. We want to shimmy this conversation on, because whilst these historical ways of imagining things, and just to sort of pick up on Alan's point he made in the previous session about borders being, you know, imagined and real, there is this whole sense that within the nations of the UK, there are real severe implications in terms of borders, both hard and soft. And those have, you know, historical implications as well that may evoke a lot of feeling that's coming into play also. I'd like to just show you the map, because we've been talking a lot about where things are. Just to remind you, we've got a map that'll come up on the screens in a minute, showing you where people voted. So if you just take a look at that and think again about the implications of borders that may come into play, because in our next session we're going to be talking about environment and sustainability, and in particular the implications that we'll have in terms of borders and how that may impact on trade. So these borders then, I mean, for Northern Ireland, it's a massive issue.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. The whole, and it's been so interesting how in the pre-EU referendum debate, how little the border featured. And I'm talking here about the political border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and the fact that this is the only land border within the United Kingdom that with the EU, and the implications of that. So what will happen? If the rhetoric of the EU referendum is real, then the Conservatives wanted to take control of their borders, of Britain's borders. How would it do that in Northern Ireland? So that's the big question. But what's been so interesting is, in all the reading that I've been doing and preparing for the session, is how little the Conservatives has actually said about what they plan to do about this, and how really everything at the moment is all rhetoric. You know, I mean, what was so interesting was in the announcement there at the weekend by Donald Tusk, where he said that our three key pre-negotiating criteria include dealing with the Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland border, and that the UK must demonstrate to the EU that they have that issue resolved in some way, because it's crucial. So the issue is hard or soft. Will it be a militarized border? Will there be excessive customs controls? Will there be immigration controls? And what this actually means in real terms is that will there be men in huts asking and stopping you and looking for your passport? Will every truck that crosses the border with goods have to have those checked or investigated? Will you have to pay a toll in order to cross? What about all the little roads in the rural areas of Northern Ireland? Will those have to be closed down somehow? So that's a hard border. When we talk about a soft border, we're talking about a border that is like it is at the moment, completely and utterly invisible, seen only by the change of signage, road signs. And the free trade and the movement of people, the free trade of goods and all the rest. And so I think it's a really significant issue. I can talk more about it, but I'm happy to leave it there.
Our audience is talking about building walls and Hadrian's walls. And of course, you know, this has implications outside of the European Union. I mean, you know, thinking about the United States in particular. And one of the things I think with Brexit at the moment is that whilst we're considering this in the context of Europe and the importance of things, there are also global issues that are impacting on, you know, on the UK that are sort of somehow being muddied in this debate, like the borders.
Yeah, I mean, It's interesting that the UK, the Republic of Ireland, the EU have all said that they do not want to interfere with trade and the free movement of peoples, and that this will be preserved. But it seems to me that the research that's being done is saying that there will have to be some sort of hardening. I guess the question is how much and where, and the character of that hardening. I don't think anyone really envisages at the moment a Trump-like border in that sort of degree. But the realities of the alternatives are still to be negotiated, and so no one knows. It's still up for grabs.
And there's important implications for Scotland in relation to the Irish border, because if there was to be a second referendum on Scotland's place within the United Kingdom, one of the biggest arguments against that is linked to the physical border. However, if during the negotiations for Britain to leave the European Union, there is a solution to the border challenge in Ireland, well, then that, in a sense, why couldn't there be a simple solution between a border between an independent Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom? So actually, it's incredibly important politically what happens in Ireland. And of the three non-negotiating points that the European Union are opening with, that's one of them. So actually, before anything else can happen, the Westminster government has got to agree to a solution there. Yeah. So it's tremendously important political implications for Scotland.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the English-Scottish kind of border issue, it's quite interesting, I think, that the way that those two countries kind of view their core identity, because, in England, there's been, I think, over the last few years, a rejection of multiculturalism, of the idea of, cultural integration, and a move more towards kind of cultural assimilation. Yes, everyone is some people are welcome, but you have to subscribe to our way of life. Whereas increasingly in Scotland, certainly the nationalist movement, the SNP, position themselves as champions of civic nationalism. So it's, and that's a much more open kind of form of identity, which says, yes, anyone can come, you're welcome in our country, yes, subscribe to certain elements of our way of life, but maintain your own identities within that. So, I think that Brexit pulls out the differing Brexit votes in England and Scotland also indicate the kind of different directions that national identity is going in those two countries, where, Little Englandism, as George said earlier, is an element in England, and a kind of, dominant white Anglo-Saxon kind of approach is becoming, we've seen the rise of UKIP, whereas in Scotland, national identity is becoming more inclusive. And that's, I think, part of its attractiveness, part of the reason why the SNP have been so successful over the past, 15, 20 years, is because that form of national identity is one that, is obviously more attractive to the Scottish people.
Following up to that, I think in terms of borders, what we haven't yet touched upon, and we may be running out of time, is the economics of this. Because whether there are internal borders within the United Kingdom, there is certainly going to be a border between the United Kingdom and Europe. And that has got tremendously important economic implications. And I think, as the speakers were mentioning earlier on, thus far, and it's something we always encourage our students, gather the data, critically analyse the data. Actually, the debate thus far has been almost data-free. There's lots of sound bites, strong and stable being the most recent one. But if one was to ask, for example, what is the percentage of trade in agriculture between the United Kingdom and the European Union? No one's asking those questions. It's 80%. 80%. In Welsh hill farming, for example, tremendous amounts of support from the Common Agricultural Policy. Similarly, in Scotland, the biggest exports are whisky. We have lots of agricultural exports. What on earth is going to happen to them if there is this hard Brexit? These are tremendously important economic questions, and yet the political debate is relatively truth-free, quite incredibly. People are speaking in sound bites, but there's really important economic and social questions and issues that are not being addressed.
But what's been really interesting, but again, I mean, I would, I guess be saying that if you poke around and if students use the research skills that hopefully they're developing here at the OU, then you'd be able to, dig out some of this material, right? So I think, the EU has been putting out some really interesting information and factual bases for the economics of it, for the economics and the impact. And I would agree utterly with George that, Northern Ireland's economic reliance on the EU in terms of its GDP and all the rest it's considerable. It will have it's considerable negative impact, likely should there be a hard economic Brexit in place. And I think we ought to be thinking not only just about the border, and of the economic impacts, but also like cultural impacts and financial impacts, certainly in terms of like higher education and all the rest of it. So Northern Ireland, for example, is a very small country, 1.8 million people. So what happens to its universities cut off from European funding? There's lots of anxieties within the scholarly community about those sorts of issues and things, as well as all the other sort of things we've been talking about.
And as you say, so much of it is unknown. And when you start looking as well, there may be facts, but equally, as you yourself found, there is also a lot that's very, very unclear. Richard, Janice and George, thank you so much for coming along today. That's all we have time for, unfortunately. But in our next conversation, we're going to be turning to sustainability and environment. And I'd like to start that dialogue by thinking about some of the implications, and particularly within Northern Ireland and Ireland in terms of trade that may be impacted by those harder borders. But first, let's go to the hot desk and see what's happening, because I hear there are allegations of wonky cake and that these are being compared with the European Union. Sophie and HJ.
Yeah, we have managed to bring it back round to cake. It's taken a little while today, actually. We've been very focused, but we are talking about cake again. I'm disappointed with the lack of sausage rolls today. I think I'll have to make sure at lunch I go out and get some. But there has been some serious talk as well, which I know HJ is going to cover because, again, a lot more equipped to do so than I am.
I'm not too sure about that one, but I think, there's lots of interesting threads to do with like the different nations of the UK. So Davin reckons that it'll be a disadvantage, all these devolved governments wanting different things, given the different voting patterns that we've seen in these different areas. And Denzel asked about the Irish border as well, whether it be hard and soft. And I think Janice gave a really good and detailed answer to that one. And I think one of the other points that sort of was a cut through was whether or not sort of we're done reforming our democracy. Coming out of the EU, a lot of people are asking, well, is the UK government fit for purpose? Is that what should be under our radar now? Which I thought was quite an interesting point. And just points that I think have been cutting through the entire debate, how politicians are using the EU referendum for their own gain, and lots of debates about migration. Yes.
A lot of debates about migration and smaller things like they were talking about power and pollution and the environment, and there's so many ways that it affects us. I don't really realise, and I think it's really good that there's a lot of people here who seem to actually know quite a lot and have some really good opinions, and it's nice to actually be able to debate those with other people who I don't know a lot about politics and things like that, so it's nice that we can all get together and actually learn some.
I think that is the one good thing about politics, though, is everyone can talk to it to an extent, because there's something that does affect all of us. And I think one of the issues that came up is the EU's actions on the environment, which we're going into, and we're talking about powerful vacuum cleaners. So whether or not EU legislation has been too much, or actually has it made a difference? So perhaps our panellists can fill us in on that one.
Thank you, Sophie and HJ. It seems like you're having lots and lots of multiple conversations. If you're new to the Student Hub Live, I hope you're engaging with that chat as well. And if you're in the Watch Only, do come into the Watch and engage. You can do that by visiting the website studenthublive.kmi.open.ac.uk and sign in using your student or staff details, and you'll be able to see all of that chat and also our interactive widgets.